Dimitri and I are going to offer a set of short reflections, not really responses, but reflections, and then we're hoping to use most of the time to kind of really have a fuller discussion. So I am going to speak to the particular themes. I think Badalis spoke to sort of in the abstract itself, sort of the latter themes of the abstract, and I'm going to speak to the individualism, communitarianism, polarity, dualism. First, I want to speak as a theologian, right? I want to speak as a theologian and sort of indicate, remind us all that, at least within Orthodox theology, if you really think about it, Orthodox theology at its core is non-binary. And you can see this primarily, obviously, in the debates about Christ. It's very interesting in debates about Christ, of course. There's the question, who is this Jesus? Who is this Messiah? This Jesus is identified as divine, as being fully God. And yet subsequent councils, even after that, after the first two, were constantly trying to reaffirm Christ's humanity. So there's a sense in which running throughout all of Orthodox theology, beginning with Christology, there's an attempt to avoid dualisms, there is an attempt to avoid binaries. Now, given this, we see this obviously in Orthodox theological reflection on Christ, and related to that, we see this in Orthodox theological reflection on the Church. And that's why I'm convinced, for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons why I'm convinced by this sort of Eucharistic vision, which I know many people criticize as being idealistic, but a kind of Eucharistic vision in which what we see there is a kind of event of relationality that is simultaneously an event of human uniqueness. One can call it individuality. So again, you see at least an attempt to think theologically about Eucharist, about community, that is not collective, but is a kind of event in which human uniqueness, individuality, irreducibility, irreplaceability is in fact realized, manifested as an event. Now, I think that has to be a guiding image. Again, I understand the critiques, and we can talk about this perhaps, but I think that has to be a guiding image. Even if we understand that sometimes Eucharist doesn't necessarily feel that way, I still think that has to be the guiding image in the way in which Orthodox think about patterns of relationality. Now, and I've written about this as well, is that even though there are theologians like Zizioulas who speak about the Eucharist as an event, I personally think that in order for those patterns of relationality to be realized in such a way that we avoid these kinds of binary relationships, these kind of dualistic forms of life, there has to be a certain kind of asceticism. And of course, an asceticism that itself is worldly, so not an asceticism where we're thinking about Seraphim of Seraph feeding the bears and things like that. That's very dangerous. I don't recommend that. So, but a kind of asceticism that sees everyday practices, within the kitchen, at work, amongst friends, wherever it is, as sort of having this kind of ascetical dimension to it. That really the ascetical pervades every aspect of life, every single aspect of life. And it pervades every single aspect of life because ultimately we're trying to engage in certain kinds of practices that in and of themselves will help to realize, again, certain kinds of patterns of relationality. So that leads to the question about how the Orthodox Christian, in terms of this Eucharistic vision, in terms of the way in which it thinks the cosmos is structured to be able to enable and realize these patterns of relationality, how, in fact, the Orthodox Christian, both the institutional church and individual Christians, should relate to what I would call the public political space. And even there is there's a danger to dualize the political and the ecclesial. And I don't think that particular relationship should be dualized. And I've argued that the fact that we should think about it in terms of they can't be elided, they can't be identified, quite simply because the public political space is made up of people that simply do not believe what we believe. So how can that be the church? But at the same time, to see it as an over and againstness of the church is to fall back on dualisms, is to fall back on binaries, and is to engage in a kind of, call it what you will, Manichaean, Nestorian-like type of thinking. So that's the challenge, to think about the church's relationship to the political in such a way that ultimately avoids these kind of binaries. And in my opinion, sees that relationship more analogous. How is it that we can think the political that is like, in some ways similar to, like, reflective of perhaps ecclesial patterns of relationship that we're all aspiring to, but obviously not identical. So, kind of moving very quickly to the individualism, communitarianism kind of debate and discussion. I think you're all familiar, that at least within basic political philosophy, there is this kind of collective individual. Within basic political philosophy, the way the story goes is that after the 17th century, that ultimately you have this primacy of the individual over the community or over the collective. I mean, again, I know I'm being very, very simplistic, but let's just remind ourselves of the basic story. This has led to a debate, at least within the West, that became very heated in the 70s and the 80s between political liberalism and communitarianism, best represented by John Rawls and Michael Sandel. Now, the critique against political liberalism is that ultimately it led to this kind of a-relational hyper-individualism that in and of itself cannot sustain a kind of community that ultimately guarantees the kinds of rights and political freedoms that ultimately liberalism is trying in some sense to theorize into structure. The critique against communitarianism, which was, with Michael Sandel, a critique against Rawls and his liberalism, is that it ultimately kind of structures political community not in such a way that it's trying necessarily to negate these particular principles of liberalism or even or particular individual rights, but that ultimately it emphasizes the notion of the common good. But then once you have the notion of the common good, then it becomes a question of whose common good. And that's a very, very serious critique, because there's a sense in which however you sort of structure the common good, you're always going to be excluding someone else's good. And this is a little bit somewhat Agamben-like in the sense that it's impossible to some extent to think about common good or structuring community without, in some ways, thinking about the one over and against which you're structuring this common good. So there's always the common good is always built on a certain set of exclusions. Now, personally, I'm sympathetic. Again, I think theologically, at least my instinct is to kind of try to think past this kind of dualism, right? I am somewhat convinced that by the communitarian critique of liberalism, in the sense that it is kind of impossible to think about how the kinds of principles and rights and freedoms that liberalism wants to protect and theorize, they need certain kinds of patterns of relationality to be realized, right? To be somehow protected. So I don't think it can be only, as Rawls thinks, that it can only be sort of procedural. At the same time, I'm also challenged by the fact that any kind of definition of common good always seems to somehow be built around exclusions, and what are these, who actually is being excluded from this common good, and how is it that this common good can become more oppressive than liberating? I think the greatest danger of orthodoxy and Orthodox theology is that as it thinks the political, it aligns the political and the ecclesial in such a way that it ultimately wants to impose its own version of the common good. And at least lately, that own version of the common good has taken the form of being selective on very, very particular issues, mainly issues surrounding sex and sexuality. And so I think that's the greatest challenge to the Orthodox to some extent, is that how to relate to the political in such a way as to realize that the ecclesial is not the political, and that it can't really, its own particular theological definition of the common good in itself cannot become necessarily the political common good, and how orthodoxy itself can think about patterns of relationality within the political that themselves kind of, again, reflective of what we're hoping to realize in the church, are patterns of relationality that can ultimately enable, facilitate a kind of human realization of irreducibility and uniqueness, but one that's not a-relational, and one also that thinks reflectively about how it's going to react to various kinds of issues, such as issues related to sex and sexuality or the so-called traditional values, in such a way that it simply does not become kind of knee-jerk or reactionary or feels that somehow it's not being faithful to its tradition because somehow it's not protesting certain kinds of changes in laws or changes in sort of the legislative kind of the legal debate surrounding issues of sex and sexuality. So obviously I'm being a little bit provocative because perhaps I want to focus on that issue, because I think that particular kind of issue itself helps us to clarify, I think, this relationship between individualism and communitarianism, between, it's a little bit ironic if you really caught it, that Orthodox theology at its core is non-binary, and yet it seems on certain kinds of issues to very much want to be very binary. And I think that that's one of the sort of ascetical tasks or challenges, is for us to be a little bit self-reflective about how it is that we want to relate in situations where people simply do not believe what we believe, and whether in fact the church can actually affirm a common good in the political space that somehow in and of itself, with at least theologically or ecclesially, it's still having a problem admitting within its own understanding of the common good. Thank you.